The P-51 Mustang has always fascinated me. Maybe it's because of those sleek lines that looked more like a racing car with wings than a fighter plane. Maybe it's because, when I was a kid, I had a poster of a Mustang on my bedroom wall, that distinctive checkered nose art staring down at me while I did homework. Or maybe it's because this aircraft that would become the greatest fighter of World War II almost didn't happen at all, and when it did, the Americans initially didn't even want it. I mean, think about that for a second. The plane that would escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, the plane that would break the Luftwaffe's back, was originally rejected by the U.S. Army Air Forces. That's like turning down the iPhone because you're happy with your flip phone. What's the first thing that comes to mind when I say P-51 Mustang? Probably those glamorous shots of silver fighters with candy-striped tails escorting B-17s over Germany, right? Maybe you're thinking of Chuck Yeager or some other ace with a ridiculous kill count. But here's the thing. The Mustang story is so much stranger than just another successful fighter plane. This aircraft was designed in 117 days because the British were desperate, powered by an engine it wasn't designed for, and became legendary almost by accident. The Mustang story actually begins with the British Purchasing Commission showing up at North American Aviation in 1940 with a problem. They needed fighters, lots of them, and they needed them yesterday. Britain was standing alone against Nazi Germany. The Battle of Britain was raging, and they were buying every fighter they could get their hands on. The British asked North American to build P-40 Warhawks under license. Seems reasonable, right? Well, North American's president, James Dutch Kindleberger, basically said, thanks, but no thanks. He told them he could design and build a better fighter in the same amount of time it would take to set up P-40 production. The British thought he was mad, but they were desperate enough to say, prove it. So here's fact number one. And it's absolutely bonkers. North American Aviation had never built a fighter aircraft before. Not one. They'd made trainers and bombers, sure, but fighters, completely new territory. It's like a company that makes minivans suddenly announcing they're going to build a Formula One car. But chief designer Edgar Schmode and his team pulled off the impossible. They went from contract signing to first flight in just 117 days. That's less than 4 months. Modern fighter programs take decades and cost billions. The F-35 has been in development since the 1990s, but in 1940, a team of engineers with slide rules and drawing boards created one of history's greatest fighters in the time it takes most people to renovate a kitchen. Fact number two gets into the really weird stuff. The Mustang's fuselage was designed using mathematical equations borrowed from racing yacht design. Yeah, you heard that right. Edgar Schmode was obsessed with reducing drag, so he studied the work of racing yacht designers who'd spent decades figuring out how to slip through water with minimum resistance. He applied those same principles to the Mustang's fuselage, creating what's called a laminar flow airfoil. The result was an aircraft that slipped through the air like a hot knife through butter. The Mustang had about half the drag of contemporary fighters. That's not incremental improvement, that's revolutionary. But here's the kicker. The laminar flow thing didn't actually work as intended in combat conditions. Dirt, bugs, and battle damage disrupted the smooth airflow. But the Mustang was so well designed overall that it didn't matter. They'd accidentally created a masterpiece while chasing a theory that didn't quite pan out. Fact number three, and this one always makes me laugh. When the prototype first flew on October 26, 1940, it was powered by an Allison V1710 engine. This engine was fine at low altitude but absolutely wheezed above 15,000 feet. The early Mustangs were so disappointing at high altitude that the RAF relegated them to low-level reconnaissance and ground attack. The U.S. Army Air Forces took one look and said, "No thanks, we'll stick with our P-38s and P-47s." So this incredible airframe was stuck with an engine that turned it into a mediocre fighter. It's like putting a lawnmower engine in a Ferrari. The potential was there, but it just couldn't perform. The Mustang might have faded into obscurity as just another wartime aircraft that didn't quite work out, except for one man's brilliant idea. Fact number 4 is where everything changes. In 1942, a Rolls-Royce test pilot named Ronnie Harker flew a Mustang and immediately recognized that the airframe was extraordinary. He had a crazy idea. What if we rip out that wheezy Allison engine and stuff in a Rolls-Royce Merlin instead? Now, this wasn't a simple engine swap like changing your car's motor. The Merlin was designed for completely different aircraft. It had different mounting points, different cooling requirements, different everything. But the British were desperate for high-altitude fighters, so they tried it anyway. The result was like giving that Ferrari a proper engine. The Mustang went from mediocre to magnificent overnight. Suddenly it could fly higher, faster, and farther than anything else in the sky. But here's the weird part. The Americans were still skeptical. It took months of British test results and persistent lobbying before the U.S. Army Air Forces finally agreed to try the Merlin-powered Mustang. Even then, they almost canceled the program multiple times. Fact number 5 involves some absolutely wild engineering. When North Americans started building Merlin-powered Mustangs, they didn't just import British engines. They licensed the design to Packard, the luxury car company. Yes, the same Packard that made fancy automobiles was now building fighter engines. But here's where it gets interesting. Packard didn't just copy the Merlin, they improved it. British Merlins were built using traditional methods with lots of hand fitting. Packard applied American mass production techniques, creating engines that were actually more reliable than the originals. The Packard Merlin V1650 became the standard engine for American Mustangs. So you had an American airframe designed using yacht racing principles, powered by an American-built version of a British engine fighting over Europe. If that's not weird, I don't know what is. Fact number 6 is about the Mustang's range, and this is where it became a war winner. Early in the war, bomber crews flying deep into Germany had no fighter escort for most of their mission. Fighters like the P-47 could only go so far before they had to turn back. The bombers would continue alone, and the Luftwaffe would tear them apart. Losses were catastrophic. Then the Mustang showed up. With drop tanks, a P-51 could fly from England to Berlin and back, over 1,300 miles. That's like flying from New York to Miami in a single-engine fighter, with enough fuel left over to dogfight when you got there. But here's the weird part. This incredible range was partly due to the Mustang's efficiency, but also because of where they put the fuel tanks. North American installed a fuel tank right behind the pilot's seat. This made the aircraft dangerously unstable until that fuel was burned off. Pilots reported that a fully fueled Mustang handled like a pregnant cow. You had to burn off the rear tank fuel before you could really maneuver. Imagine flying into combat in an aircraft that won't turn properly until you've used up half your fuel. Fact number 7 involves the cockpit, and it's a study in contradictions. The Mustang had arguably the best visibility of any World War II fighter thanks to its bubble canopy. The pilot could see in almost every direction, which was crucial in combat. But here's what's weird. That beautiful canopy turned the cockpit into a greenhouse. On the ground in summer, temperatures inside could reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Pilots would be sweating buckets before they even took off. But at 25,000 feet, the opposite problem kicked in. The heater was inadequate, and pilots would be freezing despite their heated suits. So you'd take off cooking, climb to altitude freezing, come back down sweating again. One pilot described it as flying in a sauna that occasionally turned into a freezer. Fact number 8 is about the Mustang's armament, and this caused endless debate. Early models had 4 50 caliber machine guns. Later models had 6. Some pilots loved the 6-gun setup for the extra firepower. Others preferred the 4-gun version because it was lighter and more maneuverable. But here's the really weird bit. The guns were mounted in the wings, which meant they had to be harmonized, adjusted so the bullets converged at a specific distance. Most pilots set this for 300 yards. But the problem was, if you fired at any other distance, your bullets would be spreading out or not yet converged. You had to judge distance perfectly to get maximum effect. Some pilots got so good at this they could estimate range to within 10 yards just by looking. That's not flying, that's geometry at 400 miles per hour. Fact number 9 involves something most people never think about: the Mustang's cooling system. The Merlin engine generated enormous heat, and all that heat had to go somewhere. North American designed a brilliant system where the radiator was mounted under the fuselage in a duct. Air would flow through, cool the engine, and then be expelled out the back. But here's the clever part. The heated air was expelled at high velocity, creating a small amount of thrust. The cooling system actually added to the Mustang's speed instead of creating drag-like on most aircraft. It's called the Meredith effect, and it was so efficient that the Mustang's radiator installation actually produced net thrust at high speeds. Your cooling system was helping push you forward. That's not just good engineering, that's wizardry. Fact number 10 is about combat tactics, and this one's fascinating. Mustang pilots developed a technique called the thatch weave, where 2 fighters would fly in a crisscrossing pattern. If a German fighter got on one Mustang's tail, he'd turn toward his wingman. The wingman would then have a shot at the German. It was simple, but devastatingly effective. But here's what's weird. This tactic was actually developed for the F-4F Wildcat in the Pacific. Mustang pilots borrowed it and refined it. The Germans never really figured out an effective counter. They'd see 2 Mustangs weaving back and forth and know they were in trouble. Some Luftwaffe pilots reported that they'd break off attacks as soon as they saw Mustangs start weaving. The psychological effect was as important as the tactical advantage. Fact number 11 involves the Mustang's construction, and this shows how desperate the war effort was. Mustangs were built primarily at North Americans' plants in Inglewood, California, and Dallas, Texas. But here's the weird part. The workforce was largely women. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just propaganda. She was real, and she was building Mustangs. At peak production, over 60% of North Americans' workforce was female. These women, many of whom had never worked outside the home before, were building fighters to tolerances of thousandths of an inch. And they were fast. At peak production, North American was completing 1 Mustang every hour. That's 24 fighters per day rolling out of the factories. The Germans couldn't believe the production numbers. They thought Allied intelligence was exaggerating. Nope, just American industrial might, and a lot of very skilled women with rivet guns. Fact number 12 is about the Mustang's kill ratio, and the numbers are staggering. P-51 pilots claimed 4,950 enemy aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat. They lost about 2,520 Mustangs to all causes, including accidents, flak, and enemy fighters. But here's where it gets interesting. The actual air-to-air loss ratio was much better than that overall number suggests. Most Mustang losses were to ground fire during strafing runs, not to enemy fighters. In pure fighter versus fighter combat, the Mustang's kill ratio was somewhere around 7 to 1. That means for every Mustang shot down by an enemy fighter, Mustang pilots shot down 7 enemy aircraft. But here's the weird part. Those numbers are probably inflated. Combat claims always are. Pilots in the heat of battle would see an enemy aircraft smoking and claim it destroyed. Multiple pilots might claim the same kill. Post-war analysis suggests the real numbers were lower, but still impressive. Even if you cut the claims in half, the Mustang was still dominating. Fact number 13 involves something called compressibility, and it nearly killed several test pilots. As the Mustang approached the speed of sound in a dive, it would encounter compressibility effects. The controls would lock up, the aircraft would start buffeting violently, and the nose would tuck under, making the dive even steeper. Several pilots died before they figured out what was happening. The solution was weird. You had to trim the aircraft nose up before entering the dive, so when compressibility hit and the nose tucked under, it would level out instead of going vertical. But here's the really weird part. Some pilots reported exceeding Mach 0.85 in dives, which is faster than the Mustang was ever designed to go. They were accidentally becoming some of the first pilots to explore transonic flight, and they were doing it in an aircraft with a propeller. Chuck Yeager, before he broke the sound barrier in the X-1, was pushing Mustangs to the edge of compressibility over Germany. Fact number 14 is about the Mustang's most famous pilots, and the stories are incredible. The top Mustang ace was George Preddy with 26.83 kills. Yes, you can have fractional kills when multiple pilots share a victory. But here's what's weird about Preddy's story. He wasn't killed by the Germans. On Christmas Day 1944, he was chasing a German fighter at low level when American anti-aircraft gunners, not recognizing his Mustang, shot him down. Friendly fire killed the top Mustang ace. Then there's Chuck Yeager, who became an ace in a day by shooting down 5 German aircraft in a single mission. But before that, he'd been shot down over France, evaded capture with the help of the French resistance, and made it back to England. Normally, evaders weren't allowed to fly combat missions again because they knew too much about escape networks. Yeager lobbied all the way up to Eisenhower to get back in the cockpit. Eisenhower personally approved his return to combat. Imagine being so determined to fly that you petition the Supreme Allied Commander. Fact number 15 involves the Mustang's role in the Pacific, which most people don't know about. Everyone associates the Mustang with Europe, but it also fought in the Pacific. The very long range that made it perfect for escorting bombers to Berlin made it ideal for the vast distances of the Pacific. P-51s escorted B-29s on raids against Japan, including the atomic bomb missions. But here's the weird part. Mustangs in the Pacific had to be modified because the climate was so different. The dust in places like Iwo Jima would get into everything, requiring special filters. The heat and humidity caused different maintenance issues than in Europe, and the Japanese fighters they faced, like the Ki-84 Frank, were actually more maneuverable than the Mustang at low speeds. Pacific Mustang pilots had to develop completely different tactics than their European counterparts. Same aircraft, totally different war. Fact number 16 is about the Mustang's guns jamming, and this was a persistent problem. The .50 caliber Browning machine guns were reliable on the ground, but in flight, they'd sometimes jam. The problem was the ammunition belts. At high G-forces during combat maneuvers, the weight of the ammunition would cause the belts to shift, leading to jams. North American tried various solutions, different belt designs, stronger feed mechanisms, even changing the angle of the guns. But here's the weird part. Some pilots reported that their guns would jam, then unjam themselves after a few seconds. The vibration from the engine and the airflow would sometimes clear the jam without the pilot doing anything. So you'd be in a dogfight, your guns would stop working, you'd swear creatively, and then suddenly they'd start working again. Imagine trying to fight when you don't know if your weapons will work from one second to the next. Fact number 17 involves the Mustang's paint schemes, and there's more to this than you'd think. Early Mustangs were painted in camouflage, olive drab on top, neutral gray underneath. But in 1944, the decision was made to leave them unpainted, just bare polished aluminum. The official reason was to save weight, about 80 pounds per aircraft. But here's the weird part. The unpainted Mustangs were actually slightly faster because the smooth aluminum created less drag than paint. But there was also a psychological element. The Germans could see these silver fighters from miles away. The message was clear: we don't need to hide anymore. We own the sky. The sight of hundreds of silver Mustangs escorting bomber formations was devastating to German morale. Some Luftwaffe pilots reported that seeing the silver fighters made them realize the war was lost. The Allies had so much air superiority, they didn't even need camouflage. Fact number 18 is about the Mustang's propeller, and this is where things get technical. The Mustang used a 4-bladed Hamilton standard propeller that was 11 feet 2 inches in diameter. But here's what's weird. The propeller was so efficient that at high speeds, the tips would go supersonic. Yes, you read that right. The propeller tips would break the sound barrier even though the aircraft wasn't going that fast. This created a distinctive crackling sound that people on the ground could hear. Some described it as a ripping or tearing sound. German soldiers learned to recognize that sound and would dive for cover. The Mustang was announcing its presence with sonic booms from its propeller tips. But there was a downside. Those supersonic propeller tips created shock waves that reduced efficiency. At maximum speed, the Mustang's propeller was actually working against itself. Engineers knew about this but couldn't do much about it with 1940s technology. Fact number 19 involves the Mustang's most audacious mission, and it wasn't over Germany. In 1945, Mustangs flew from Iwo Jima to Japan and back, a round trip of over 1,500 miles, to escort B-29s. But here's the weird part. The Mustangs had to fly at the B-29's cruise speed, which was slower than the Mustang's most efficient speed. So the fighters had to weave back and forth above the bombers to avoid stalling. They were flying a longer distance than the bombers they were escorting, and if a Mustang had any kind of mechanical problem, there was nowhere to land except the ocean. The pilots knew that if they went down, rescue was unlikely in those waters. Yet they flew these missions repeatedly. One pilot described it as the longest, most boring, most terrifying mission possible. Hours of nothing. Then maybe a brief fight. Then hours more of hoping your engine kept running. Fact number 20, and this one's my favorite, involves what happened to Mustangs after the war. You'd think such a successful fighter would have a long service life, but the jet age arrived fast. By 1950, most Mustangs were being retired or sold off. But here's where it gets weird. Mustangs found second lives in the strangest places. Some were converted into racing aircraft and are still racing today at Reno. Some were sold to smaller air forces and fought in conflicts for decades. Israel used Mustangs in 1948. The Indonesians flew them in the 1950s. Some ended up as crop dusters. There are photos of Mustangs with spray booms attached, dusting fields in California. Imagine a fighter that escorted bombers to Berlin, ending its days spraying pesticides on lettuce. But the weirdest fate was the Mustangs that were simply scrapped. Thousands of them, cut up for aluminum. Aircraft that had fought across Europe and the Pacific, that had saved countless bomber crews, that had helped win the war, were melted down and turned into pots and pans. There's a good chance that some piece of aluminum in your kitchen was once part of a Mustang. That's both sad and somehow fitting. But here's what really gets me about the Mustang. This was an aircraft that shouldn't have existed. North American had no business designing a fighter. The British had no business trusting an unproven company. The Allison engine was wrong. The Merlin engine wasn't designed for it. Everything about the Mustang's development was improvised, rushed, and borderline chaotic. And yet, it worked. It more than worked. It became the fighter that changed the war. Before the Mustang, the 8th Air Force was being bled white over Germany. After the Mustang, the Luftwaffe was broken. The Mustang made the strategic bombing campaign possible. It allowed the Allies to achieve air superiority over Europe. It helped shorten the war and save countless lives. The Mustang flew 213,173 sorties and destroyed 4,950 enemy aircraft in the air, plus another 4,131 on the ground. But behind those numbers are thousands of stories. Young men, most barely out of their teens, climbing into these machines and flying into harm's way. The average age of a Mustang pilot was 22. Think about that. At 22, most people today are finishing college. These guys were dogfighting over Berlin. The loss rate was brutal. Of the 15,586 Mustangs built, thousands were lost in combat. Each one had a pilot, and many of those pilots never came home. Yet the Mustang soldiered on. It adapted to every role thrown at it. Fighter escort, ground attack, reconnaissance, even dive bomber. There was seemingly nothing this aircraft couldn't do. What strikes me most about these weird facts is how they reveal the Mustang's true nature. It wasn't just a machine, it was a collection of brilliant improvisations, happy accidents, and sheer determination. It was yacht racing mathematics applied to aircraft design. It was a British engine in an American airframe. It was women building fighters in California factories. It was pilots learning to fight in a greenhouse that turned into a freezer. It was propeller tips breaking the sound barrier and cooling systems that created thrust. The last Mustangs were retired from military service in the 1980s by the Dominican Republic. But hundreds still fly today. When you see one at an air show, that distinctive Merlin growl echoing across the field, remember these weird facts. Remember that you're not just looking at a fighter plane. You're looking at 117 days of frantic design work, at Packard-built Merlins, at fuel tanks that made the aircraft unstable, at guns that jammed and unjammed themselves, at propellers that went supersonic, at an aircraft that was almost canceled multiple times and ended up changing the course of history. And you know what? Part of me hopes we never forget these stories, because they remind us that even the most legendary machines are built by people making their best guesses, improvising solutions, and sometimes just getting lucky. The Mustang proves that sometimes, just sometimes, giving an unproven company an impossible deadline and trusting them to figure it out can create something extraordinary. So next time someone mentions the P-51 Mustang, sure, tell them about the long-range escorts to Berlin. Tell them about the aces and the kill ratios, but maybe also tell them about the yacht racing equations, about the greenhouse cockpit, about the women with rivet guns building one fighter every hour, about the propeller tips breaking the sound barrier, about the fighters that ended their days as crop dusters. Because that's the real story of the Mustang, not just what it did, but how wonderfully, weirdly, impossibly it came to be. And if you found these facts as fascinating as I do, hit that like button and subscribe, because there are so many more stories like this waiting to be told. Stories of incredible machines built by ordinary people doing extraordinary things, and I want to share every single one of them with you.